Hey guys, so I was going to my bad, that was my headset, hold on. My bad, okay. Um, so I was going to, but, I got a house to myself. My mom's at a game, and my sister is out with her man, was seeing a movie, and I just got home from work, so by myself, so I figured, uh, another chapter, chapter 6, Souls on Being Human. People do some weird things. In 1907, Dr. Duncan McDougall carried out a bizarre series of experiments in Haverhill, Hill, Massachusetts. McDougall weighed patients who were dying of tuberculosis and reported a strange and sudden weight loss at a moment of death. That is not the point. McDougall's experiment is a telling indicator of the deeply influential in Western culture. So, how do we think? What is distinct about human beings? Do we have souls? Are we souls? Anyway, what exactly is a soul? In this chapter, we will consider some of the deepest questions we ask about ourselves. Let's begin by thinking about the widespread belief that we are nothing but a collection of chemicals. Human beings can be described or defined as at multiple levels. Each level helps us understand the complexity of human nature. The physicist will tell us that we are made of atoms and molecules. She is right, but she is wrong if she adds that ridiculous word just. The chemist will tell us that life is the result of complex chemical reactions leading to food being converted to energy. The physiologist will tell us about the various organs that make up the human body and what each of them does. These are all true. Yet we transcend all of these levels of description. If humanity is defined by anything, it is not by what we find at the bottom of that ladder, but by what we find at the top. That is what makes us different. That is what makes us human. One of the reasons why science is so successful concerns its use of reductive explanation by which complex systems are reduced to more manageable, simpler mechanisms. Although there is a growing realization that this form of explanation experiences difficulties in coping with many aspects of the biological sciences, its usefulness in the field of physics is beyond doubt. So, what are we to make of strongly reductive accounts of human nature, such as this oracular pronouncement from the biologist Francis Crick? You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are nothing but a pack of neurons. Crick's highly reductive approach to our human identity assumes that a complex system is no more than the sum of its parts. It may be a little more sophisticated than the routine declaration that we are nothing but atoms and molecules, but its basic assumption remains the same. Human identity is framed in terms of the basic components of the human body. There is no recognition of the emergence within human beings of any properties that transcend those of our individual components. Emergence is a natural process by which high-level properties arise within systems through interactions at lower levels that do not themselves exhibit such properties. Higher levels of systems thus cannot be reduced to lower levels. One of the key lessons from the concept of emergence is that if we fully understand things on one level of reality, that does not mean we can explain or predict what happens at the next level. Physics cannot predict biology. Another reductionist approach to human nature is based on our biological history rather than our chemical or biological components. We are just naked apes. To quote the title of a book by the English zoologist Desmond Morris, which became a bestseller when it appeared in 1967, it gets headlines, but it is just wrong. We're actually ex-apes. We have evolved beyond that. To imagine that human nature can be defined in terms of our ancestry is to deny both biological evolution and, more importantly, cultural evolution. Anthropology supplements are a purely biological account of human evolution by stressing the importance of cultural factors in enabling human beings to evolve beyond their biological limits. Yet perhaps the best known form of biological reductionism in recent years is the view that genes are the basic elements of biological reality. In what follows, we will look at this interesting approach. Richard Dawkins is one of the most high profile defenders of the gene's eye view of evolution, which was very popular back in the 1980s, although it has since fallen out of favor. This approach sees biological organisms such as human beings as complicated machines controlled by our genes. For Dawkins, everything is determined by our DNA, the complex biological molecule which transmits genetic information. DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. We are simply there to allow our genes to transfer themselves to future generations. Viewed through the lens of Dawkins' scientific reductionism, human beings are just gene perpetuating machines. Genes swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. So that's settled then. That is what science tells us about human nature and identity, but it does not. This is metaphysical pontification, not scientific analysis. Dawkins is offering his own idiosyncratic interpretation of the science, not the neat science itself. What is there in Dawkins' words cited above that can be proved experimentally? It is mostly speculation passed off as if it were a solid scientific consensus. The best criticism of Dawkins' genetic reductionism comes from Denis Noble, the distinguished Oxford biologist credited by many with the invention of systems biology, an approach to biology which recognizes the complexity of biological systems, noting particularly the failure of reductionist approaches to biology to explain how the properties of such systems emerge. Noble argues that the observed complexity of biological systems demands skepticism about reductionist interpretations. We are forced to recognize that properties emerge within these systems which transcend those of their individual components. So, what does Noble make of Dawkins' genetic reductionism? Not much. For Noble, the only factually correct element in Dawkins' bold statement quoted above is that genes are in you and me. The rest is not empirical, metaphysical speculation which smuggles in all kinds of unverified ideological pre-commitments. To make this point absolutely clear, Noble playfully rewrote Dawkins' statement, turning his metaphysical assumptions on their head, or retaining the single empirically verifiable statement in Dawkins' original piece. Genes are trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, communicating with it by complex processes through which, blindly as if by magic, function emerges. They are in you and me. We are the system that allows their code to be read, and their preservation is totally dependent on the joy that we experience in reproducing ourselves. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence. Here, humans are represented as being in control. We are active. Our genes are passive. So, what in Noble's passage is observable and what is speculative? As before, the only thing that can be evidently confirmed is that the genes are in you and me. The remainder is speculative and lies beyond empirical investigation. Dawkins and Noble see things in completely different ways. They cannot both be right. Both smuggle in a series of quite different values and beliefs, yet their statements are empirically equivalent. In other words, they both have equally good grounding in observation and experimental evidence. So how can we decide which is to be preferred on scientific grounds? As Noble observes, no one seems to be able to think of an experiment that would detect an empirical difference between them. Now, science helps us understand how we function, but there is a lot more to human identity than this. C.S. Lewis regularly protested against reductionist accounts of reality. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, one of the children shows off of his scientific knowledge of astronomy to Mandu. An old man who lived on an Narnian island in our world, said Eustace, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. The old man was not impressed. Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. Lewis's point was that we too easily fall into the trap of believing that describing the components of a star is equivalent to establishing its identity. Science uses reductionist approach as one of the several tools to study a system. It makes sense. If you break the system down into its individual parts, you will end up understanding the behavior of the whole system better. But that is not the full picture. When the components of a system come together, new properties emerge at the level of the system as a whole which were not present in any of its components beforehand. A complex system such as the human body has properties that we often cannot anticipate or predict from our knowledge of the properties of the individual parts. Reductionism has severe limits, especially in biology. There is a line in one of Plato's dialogues that always makes me sit up. Some say that the body, soma, is a tomb, sima, of the soul, psyche. Since the soul is buried for the time being, the slogan "the body is a tomb," which rhymes in Greek has had a deep impact on Western thought. Plato suggested that the soul could be liberated from its imprisonment by philosophy. The Greek mystery religions held that the immortal soul imprisoned or entombed in a material body was only liberated at death. More recently, the philosopher Socrates developed a similar position which defined human nature in terms of a physical body and immortal soul. The popular view of human nature, reflected in some Christian theologians, draws a distinction between the physical human body and the material human soul. Humans, it was argued, were distinguished from all other animals and inanimate objects by the possession of this immaterial immortal soul, which was liberated from the body at the moment of death. This approach was held to be justified on biblical grounds, in that the New Testament generally speaks of body and soul, and occasionally of body, soul, and spirit. References to the body were understood by some older Christian writers to refer to the physical and material parts of humanity, whereas the soul was understood as an immaterial and an eternal spiritual entity which merely resided within the human body. Yet it is widely agreed that this is not how the writers of the Bible understood these ideas. The notion of an immaterial soul was a secular Greek concept, not a biblical notion. The Old Testament conceives of humanity as an animated body and not as an incarnate soul. The biblical version of humanity was that of a single entity, an inseparable psychosomatic unit with many facets or aspects. Soul is an Anglo-Saxon term used to translate a variety of biblical terms, often having the general sense of life. Thus, the Hebrew word nefsib, translated as soul in some older English Bibles, really means a living being. We find that same pattern in the New Testament in his letters. Paul does not use terms such as flesh and spirit to refer to parts of the human body, rather they are to be seen as different modes of human existence. As the New Testament scholar James Dunn points out, Paul adopts an aspective, not a partitive, understanding of terms such as soul, flesh, and body. Paul's conception of the human person is of a being who functions within several dimensions. To live according to the flesh does not mean being directed by some specific part of the body, but simply to live at a purely human level. Modern neuroscience has no place for the idea of a soul understood as some immaterial part of the body. Neither does the Christian Bible. The soul-body dualism lives on in particular culture, both secular and Christian. Yet the best view found in both contemporary neuroscience and Christian theology is to think of humanity as a physical unity, a single body, not a body and a soul. How does this affect Christian thinking about personal identity and the hope of heaven, areas in which the idea of an immortal soul might seem to be useful? Most Christian theologians frame their understanding of both identity and hope in relational terms. It is a way of thinking that is rooted in the Bible and sees a believer identity as rooted in and sustained by their relationship with God. Each of us exists within a network of relationships, parents, children, relatives, and friends. Our social identity is framed in terms of these relationships. That is one of the reasons why the theme of being remembered by God is so important. We do not need the idea of a soul to make sense of this idea. The concept of a relationship works perfectly well and has been reappropriated since the First World War within both philosophy and theology to help articulate our understanding of our personal identity as human beings. Whether you think Christianity is right or wrong, there is no getting away from one of its core ideas, that we are in some way hardwired to think about, even long for God. It is an idea that is set out in the opening paragraph of what is now increasingly regarded as the most important theological text in Western Christianity, Augustine of Hippo's Confessions, written between 397 and 400. It is the prayer in which Augustine sets out this idea. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. This idea of a natural desire for God has been developed in all sorts of ways within the Christian tradition, such as Pascal's idea of a God-shaped abyss within human nature which is too deep to be satisfied by anything less than God, or C.S. Lewis's idea of a deep sense of yearning for significance which both originates from and leads back to God. But the basic idea is simple. Belief in God, like the phenomenon of religion itself, is natural. The Christian narrative tells us about a natural desire for God. The scientific narrative tells us about a desire for God that is natural. It is not difficult to see how these narratives can be interwoven at this point. The rise of the Age of Reason saw this view challenged it in a number of ways. Many argue that religion was imposed upon people. Far from being something natural, it was something that was demanded of us by our culture, or which arose from pressures of social conformity. Yet these are now strong indications that religion is something natural. That does not make it right or wrong. Where rationalism held that religion arose through the sleep of reason, in other words, through the suspension of normal human critical and rational faculties, there is now a growing consensus that religion is best understood as a natural phenomenon, a cognitively natural human activity which arises through, not in spite of, natural human ways of thinking. There are many fascinating questions that need to be explored arising from this recognition of natural religious tendencies. First, suppose we grant that religious beliefs arise naturally in human cognitive development. Is this good news or bad news for theism or atheism? The jury is out on this one, although I personally think that it works more for theism's favor. Second, does a natural inclination towards religion imply that theism is natural? After all, religion takes many forms. It is not an empirical notion, and theism is one of them. And third, how do people move from this natural religion to a specific religious tradition, for example, Christianity? Older discussions of these issues may still retain some of their importance, but it is clear that the whole field has now moved on significantly. The empirical discipline which has explored this topic is a relatively new arrival on the scene. The term cognitive science of religion, introduced by the Oxford scholar Justin Barrett, has come to designate approaches to the study of religion that are derived from the cognitive sciences. One of the basic empirical findings of this school of thought is that religion arises through normal processes of thought, not in opposition to them. It is a natural aspect of being human, whether it is right or wrong. Religion is natural in that it arises from human cognitive processes that are automatic, unconscious, and not dependent on culture. The core narrative of Christianity and Judaism speaks of humanity being created in the image of God with some kind of homing instinct for its creator. The emerging scientific narrative speaks of religion as cognitively human, natural human activity. These narratives are not the same. Now, let me just check to see where I'm at. Okay. But they are clearly related. Might the notion of humanity bearing God's image map onto cognitive accounts of natural religious instincts? There are clearly important possibilities for dialogue here. These findings have led to some surprising conclusions. Thus, Robert McCauley, director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture at Emory University, has argued that while religion is a natural outcome of human cognitive processes, the natural sciences are not. McCauley's point is that both science and theology involve abstract formulations that are seriously counterintuitive and require cultural support. This leads McCauley to conclude that science depends more fundamentally than religion on institutional and cultural support. If civilization were to collapse, religion would persist, whereas science would have to be rebuilt. McCauley also draws the important and potentially controversial conclusion that this approach to religion suggests that people with certain cognitive impairments, such as autism or any autistic spectrum conditions, will find religion to be largely inscrutable and cognitively challenging. That's me right there. In other words, they just will not get what religion is all about. A recent empirical study appears to confirm this conclusion, finding that mentalizing deficits associated with the autistic spectrum, which are more commonly found in men than in women, may undermine this intuitive cognitive support for religion. It remains to be seen whether this finding is confirmed by more detailed studies and what the implications of this might be for contemporary discussions about religion and atheism. This cognitive approach to religion unquestionably helps us understand why religion is ubiquitous in human culture. Religion is so common within and across cultures because of its cognitive naturalness. C.S. Lewis may have overstated things when he suggested that the human search for meaning was as natural as sexual desire or physical hunger and thirst. But you can see what he's getting at and why the new cognitive approaches to the origins of religion reinforce his point. The origins of religious belief do not lie so much in cultural or social conditions as in the intuitions that arise from normally developing and functioning human cognitive systems. This strongly suggests that the secular humanist and new atheist visions for a totally secular human world are simply unrealistic. In that religion will naturally reemerge, even where it is suppressed, it also suggests that non-religious people possess natural capacities and tendencies which might have otherwise lead to religion, but which have either not yet been activated by any triggers in their environment or experienced or have been suppressed by social or cultural pressures. So why are we hardwired in this way? Nobody really knows, and it is tempting to present somewhat speculative, just so stories as if they were genuine explanations. But before we can offer a Darwinian explanation of the origins of religion, we need to determine whether religion is biologically adaptive or not. as religion helped us survive. Some scholars argue that there is no obvious adaptive function to religion, while others hold that religion can clearly be understood in adaptionist terms. There is simply no scholarly consensus on this matter at present. Unfortunately, that has not stopped some new atheist writers from presenting their own somewhat trenchant views on the nature and value of religion as if they were the solid foundings of reputable science. In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins declares that religion is not adaptive and damages people. If religious beliefs are adaptive in any sense, he insists, it is only in that they act successfully as cultural parasites within their human hosts. Yet his analysis is conspicuously lacking in empirical engagement of any kind. As the leading evolutionary theorist David Sloan Wilson argued, the God Delusion suggests that Dawkins is just another angry atheist trading on his reputation as an evolutionist and spokesperson for science to vent his personal opinions about religion. Yet there is a point that needs further comment here. If religion is natural, what does this have to say about the movement that calls itself humanism? From about 1983 to 1988, I spent a lot of my professional life studying the emergence and intellectual characteristics of Renaissance humanism, especially in the great cities of Switzerland and in the first decades of the 16th century. It was a wonderful experience in which I came to admire and even to share some of the key beliefs and aspirations of the great humanists of that age, such as Erasmus of Rotterdam. I shared their belief in the importance of studia humanitatis, humane studies, what we would now call the humanities, especially grammar, rhetoric, poetry, moral philosophy, and history. In the Renaissance, a humanist was someone who valued the humanities and recognized their transformative potential both for individual and for culture as a whole. It was easy to see why the humanists believed that European culture would be renewed by a return to the wisdom of the past, as found in the writings and architectural styles of classical Rome and Athens. There was no particular hostility toward religion within Renaissance humanism, although Erasmus and other humanists of his age delighted in lampooning the more ridiculous aspects of the institutional church. Anyone who bothers to read Erasmus's commentaries on the New Testament or his landmarks, Enrichidon Militis Christiani, Handbook of the Christian Soldier, will discern his love of God and his belief that religion, when properly implemented, was of enormous cultural importance. So why do we now think of humanism as anti-religious? Why do people now use the word humanism to refer to a worldview that rejects God? After all, the Renaissance invented the word humanist, and it meant nothing like this. The answer is that one specific form of humanism, an explicitly secular humanism, gained the cultural ascendancy in the West during the 20th century, leading people to equate humanism and secular humanism. This transformation in the cultural understanding of humanism was primarily due to Paul Kurtz, one of America's most prominent secular humanists. Kurtz was instrumental in reshaping American humanism in a specifically secular direction during the late 1970s and early 1980s, largely by suppressing its historic religious origins and continuing religious associations and commitments. Kurtz disliked the original American Humanist Manifesto, which made specific approving reference to religious humanism and was drafted by a range of individuals, including many religious figures. Kurtz vigorously advocated a more secular form of humanism and established the Council for Secular Humanism to lobby for a radical change in direction of the American Humanist Association. He was clearly successful. Most people now tend to think of humanism as secular humanism, having lost sight of the rich range of possibilities, many of which are religious, that were once associated with the term. Kurtz was one of the two primary authors of Humanist Manifesto II, setting out a vision for a form of humanism that was systematically evacuated of religious possibilities and affirmations. I have no problem with anyone using the phrase secular humanism to refer to this movement, but this must never be confused with the generous and noble vision of humanism we find in Erasmus and the leading figures of the Renaissance. Erasmus would be appalled at the dogmatism and anti-religious tone of this more recent variant of the movement he once so proudly represented. Given Renaissance humanism's love of the humanities, it is shocking to realize how far the movement has lost its intellectual and cultural bearings when so many of its representatives are scientific imperialists who dismiss the humanities as irrelevant. Mary Midgley, who clearly considers herself to be a non-theistic humanist, makes an important point on how an aggressively anti-theistic humanism can pull the rug out from under itself. And an important essay entitled "The Paradox of Humanism," Midgley points out the vulnerability of reductive forms of humanism, which eliminates the transcendent in the mistaken belief that this safeguards the human. Humanism, she argues, exists to celebrate and increase the glory of human life, without having to express any devotion toward any entities outside it, such as God. But as soon as anyone starts to eliminate those entities, valuable elements in human life begin to unravel. The center begins to bleed. Why? Because the patterns essential to human life turn out to be one that cannot be altogether contained within it. As Midgley puts it, to be fully human seems to involve being interested in other things as well as human ones, and sometimes more than human ones. But the new cognitive science of religion raises a much deeper question. The cognitive science of religion tells us that humans are naturally religious. So if it is natural to be religious, how can any form of humanism be opposed to religion? It is time to suggest that secular humanism needs to name itself for what it really is and abandon any pretensions to stand in the noble tradition of Erasmus and the Renaissance. Any form of humanism rests on an understanding of what human nature really is and what longings, desires, and aspirations are naturally human. The Christian humanist declares that humanity finds its true goal in finding God. The secular humanist declares that humanity finds its true goal in rejecting God. But to pretend that humanism is necessarily secular humanism is indefensible. It is surely time to move on. Christian humanism is alive and well, even if secular humanism pretends it does not and cannot exist. There are some things that are not true, but I wish that they were true. Probably because I am an academic, I often want to cling to the charming but rather naive view that human beings are essentially good. I would like to think that if there is anything wrong with people, it can be sorted out by educating them properly. After all, education is about more than providing people with skills to learn a living. It is about making them into better human beings. This is a noble vision for education, and one that it is probably just wrong. We all know about the darker side of human nature, even if we prefer not to talk about it, perhaps fearing where such thoughts might lead us. Any worldview which fails to do justice to this fundamental ambiguity within human nature ends up causing massive cognitive dissonance, as the harsh realities of observation experience obstinately refuse to fit the neat little theoretical box. When I was younger, I happily accepted the Enlightenment's worldview of the constant improvement of the human condition through science and technology. I don't anymore. Not because I have lapsed into some kind of irrationality, but simply because the evidence so strongly suggests it is wrong. I share the views of the cultural theorist Terry Eagleton, and Roots to a Finer World. What sort of things does Eagleton have in mind? To progress. We may know more than we used to, but we seem to end up using this knowledge badly. The World War provides us with ample, if unsettling and sobering, food for thought. The significance of the Nazi extermination camps for any account of human nature can hardly be overlooked. They prompted George Steiner's famous observation that someone could read great poetry or play great music in the evening and then take great part in mass murder or an industrial scale the next day. We know that a man can read Goethe or Rilke in the evening, and he can play Bach and Schubert and go to his day to work with Auschwitz in the morning. While I personally doubt if many of those running those death camps like Rilke and Goethe, or even when capable of playing Bach or Schubert, Steiner's points remains important. German poetry and music, emblematic of one of Europe's most sophisticated and humane cultures, ultimately failed to humanize. Or we might think of the infamous Wannsee Conference of January 1942, which did so much to prepare the way for the extermination of the Jews at camps like Auschwitz. The majority of those present at the meeting of Nazi technocrats were highly educated with doctorates or medical qualifications for German universities. Once more, education had failed to humanize. Now, these observations prove nothing, but they do point to a pattern, not a consistent pattern of pure evil, and certainly not of pure goodness, but of human complexity and ambiguity. My own view, adopted with regret in the light of the evidence, is that simplistic narratives of fundamental human goodness and inevitable progress have to be rejected as myths, representing a blind faith in a utopian human nature which bears little obvious relation to what we see in history and culture, especially in darker moments of the history of Europe in the 20th century. We need a better narrative if we are to do justice to reality and face up to its implications. We need to draw on a richer, if more disturbing, view of reality to help us here in our conversation about human selfishness and evil, such as Carl Jung's notion of the shadow, or Richard Dawkins' notion of the selfish gene, or the Christian notion of the original sin, which boldly face up to this disquieting aspect of human nature at the age of reason, understandably but wrongly prefer to gloss over. In his influential work, The Selfish Gene, Dawkins notes that what he terms just gene selfishness will normally give rise to selfishness in individual behavior. Humans struggle to resist the tyranny of the selfish replicators, which predisposes them to behave in selfish ways. While Dawkins believes that human beings are able to resist such gene selfishness, his point about our innate predisposition toward selfish behavior is an important corrective to naive views about human goodness. For Dawkins, we might be able to make ourselves good, but this happens by fighting against our genic inheritance. One of the aspects of the Christian vision of reality that I have increasingly come to appreciate over the years is the notion of original sin. This is often misunderstood and misrepresented. When rightly understood, however, it offers a realistic account of human nature as morally ambiguous, capable of good, yet with a tendency, even a propensity to seek the lesser good or experience the lure of evil and fall into unhelpful patterns of habituation and dependency. Original sin is not about personal fault or guilt, but affirms the uncomfortable insight that human nature is wounded and damaged and thus prone to think and act wrongly. Perhaps it is no wonder that many English eminent writers were so hostile toward this idea, which called into question its assumptions about the goodness and rationality of human nature. If a man is the measure of all things, Alexander probed, what happens if we are flawed? That was the point that the Soviet dissident and novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn made in his former commencement address at Harvard University in 1978. After his experiences of the brutal political and intellectual repression of the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn had no doubt about the limitations of human nature. The dreadful events of the 20th century made it clear to any thinking person that the Enlightenment vision of humanity was a delusion, a fiction with no counterpart in reality. It had made man the measure of all things on earth, imperfect man who was never free of pride, self-interest, envy, vanity, and dozens of other defects. We are now paying for the mistakes which were not properly appraised at the beginning of the journey. The paradox is that we need human beings to expose the limitations of human nature, adopting a self-critical attitude which challenges some core assumptions of our self-understanding. The Christian faith gives us a critical lens through which to view the complex motivations and mixed agendas of human beings. We bear God's image, yet we are sinful. We are sinful. We are capable of good, just as we are capable of evil. We often find ourselves trapped by our own natures, ending up doing wrong rather than right, and wondering what can be done to liberate ourselves from this dilemma. This way of thinking allows us to frame the complex picture we see of human culture and history, characterized by aspirations to greatness and goodness on one hand, and oppression and violence on the other. Earlier in this work, I suggested that science and religion were two of the greatest, if not the greatest, outcomes of human civilization. But in the light of the above discussion, we need to ask a difficult and uncomfortable question: what happens when they go wrong? When we are all human beings with the strengths and weaknesses that this brings. It is great when science and religion work well, but since both are undertaken by human beings, both can go badly wrong. And let's be honest about this, both do go wrong. Is science a religion? Richard Dawkins is often asked this question and has a standard answer. No, the sciences, he argues, have all the good points of religious belief and none of its bad points. They evoke a sense of wonder at reality and offer humanity uplift and inspiration. And they are immune from the problems of faith. It is a neat answer, and it makes sense if the science is at its best is compared with religion at its worst. But it is just not that simple. Scientists are human beings, and human beings naturally mess things up, including both science and religion. So let's try to tell a more reliable story. Every scientist I know is aware of the problems that science faces in the universities. Relentless pressure to generate more research income and perform well in institutional league tables. Alongside these institutional pressures, some scientists, as human beings, long for fame and fortune. So should we be surprised that some scientists cheat and produce research papers that turn out to be based on forged results? It is becoming a serious problem, and many journals are tightening up their review process as a result. Following growing evidence of manipulation of the process by assumed and fabricated identities, I have no intention of discussing any of these cases in detail. My point is simple and irrefutable. Some scientists do bad things, but that does not make science bad. Like anything that human beings do, it can go wrong. And science can go wrong in other ways. Again, reflecting human evil, naivete, or downright stupidity. One of the greatest threats we face today is from weapons of mass destruction such as nuclear weapons. Who invented these? Scientists. Now, if some were to use the flawed logic of Christopher Hitchens, a few members of Group X do bad things, therefore Group X is bad, you could write off science as morally disastrous and wicked. Since it spawns such evil, it must itself be evil. But everyone knows this is nonsense. Things are more complicated than this. Let me give you a case study which illustrates the problems and then comment on it. When I was studying chemistry at Oxford back in the early 1970s, I frequently had to read the works of one of America's greatest scientists, Louis Frederick Fieser, as preparation for tutorials. Fieser, who became professor of chemistry at Harvard University in 1930, was famous for developing the artificial synthesis of a series of important naturally occurring compounds, including vitamin K, necessary for blood coagulation. His work also prepared the ground for the synthesis of steroids, such as cortisone, with important medical applications. He was clearly well regarded within the world of organic chemistry in those days, and was referenced regularly and appreciatively in organic chemistry lectures I attended at Oxford. Later I discovered that Fieser invented something else that was not mentioned in those Oxford lectures. The United States had entered the Second World War following the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The Department of Defense soon realized that operational requirements in both the European and Pacific war theaters required the development of new chemical weapons. Fieser created what the Department of Defense was looking for on Valentine's Day in 1942 at a secret Harvard War Research Laboratory. He invented napalm, a chemical gel which, once ignited, stuck to human bodies and could not be removed. It burned at high temperatures and could not be extinguished. On the night of March 9 and 10, 1945, the U.S. Air Force dropped 1,700 tons of napalm bombs on the city of Tokyo, causing massive loss of civilian life. It is thought that over 87,500 people died that night. An immediate loss of life greater than that caused by either of the atom bombs dropped a few months later on the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What are we to make of this? An aggressive ideological critic might argue that this demonstrates the fundamental immorality of science. I do not see it that way. It is just one of many signs of human failure and weakness, by which good things are abused and put to bad uses. That is what human beings are like. We need to be honest about the problem and face up to the fact that science can be, and as a matter of fact is being abused. But that does not make science bad. If there is a problem, it lies deeper in human nature itself. And that is true of religion as well. Religion can go wrong and does go wrong. In 1932, William Temple, then Archbishop of York, and later Archbishop of Canterbury, declared what he called bad religion was not only the most serious problem facing humanity in the modern world, but its chief enemy. Religion itself, when developed to real maturity, knows quite well that the first object of its condemnation is bad religion, which is a totally different thing from real religion, and can be very much worse thing. Temple is right. Religion can turn bad. It can go wrong, and when it does, it must be challenged and changed. That is why Temple singled out the prophets of Israel and Jesus of Nazareth as reformers who call into question the religious conventions of their day. Yet while Temple sees religion as something that can go wrong, new atheists such as Christopher Hitchens see it as something that is intrinsically wrong. Hitchens is clearly using an ideological rather than empirical perceptual framework which conflates religiosity with irrationality and rationality with evil acts. Yes, religion can go wrong, invoking God's name to incite evil, but sadly most human ideals get abused like this. We need to inject a note of realism here. Just about anything that human beings can do can go wrong. Science is no exception, neither is religion. Michael Shermer, a noted critic of religion, widely points out that religion has been implicated in some tragedies and outrages such as holy wars. Yet it is more complicated than this, as Shermer insists we need to tell the full story. However, for every one of these grand tragedies, there are 10,000 acts of personal kindness and social good that go unreported. Religion, like all social institutions of such historical depth and cultural impact, cannot be reduced to an unambiguous good or evil. Science has been grossly abused. Witness the forms of social Darwinism which emerged in Nazi Germany, now widely condemned as an abomination, yet seen as progressive by many social liberals at the time. I am perfectly prepared to accept that this is bad science and not to judge science by its bastardizations. Both science and religion can spawn monsters, but they need not do so, nor should either be judged by its pathological forms. But there's a really interesting question here which secular humanists have overlooked. What does bad religion tell us about humanity? Bernard Williams has long been one of my favorite philosophers. From conversations around Oxford, I know I'm not on my own here. His writings on ethics are always stimulating, especially his critique of the modern tendency to evaluate the moral standards of the past in terms of what we believe today. Williams is hostile toward religion and dubious of its intellectual and moral virtues. Philosophical acuity leads him to pose an awkward question which has been by the secular humanist establishment. Since secular humanism believes that religion is not a fiction, what does this tell us about human nature itself? For granted that this transcendental claim is false, human beings must have dreamed it, and we need an understanding of why this was the content of their dream. Humanism is the of a secularist and anti-religious movement seems seldom to have faced fully a very immediate consequence of its own views that this terrible thing religion is a human creation. It is a point that will probably have occurred to the more reflective readers of the anti-religious creators, and if God turns out to be a genocidal type, as Hitchens colorfully but somewhat improbably suggests, then that is what we are all like as well. In scapegoating God or religion for the rational and moral failings of human beings, the new atheism has exposed a serious incoherence in its own worldview. Everything that is wrong with the world, we are told, can be blamed on God or religion. But if God and religion are human inventions, then it is human beings, not some non-existent God, who are to blame for any evil and violence they cause. If God is evil and pernicious, as new atheist writers assure us is indeed the case, then this God was invented by evil and pernicious human beings. If religion perverts us, we have merely perverted ourselves. Now let me make it clear that I see no reason to share this puzzling notion that God is evil. But suppose, purely for the sake of argument, that the new atheism is justified in asserting that this invented God is evil. If we create God in our own image, and this God is evil, what does that say about us? If there is no God, we cannot blame this non-existent God for human evil. The fault is ours alone. Our belief about God are a mirror which shows up what we are really like. The only way out of this dilemma is to appeal to the moral dualism that underlies so many failed philosophies and religions of the past. This version of this flawed worldview holds that there are bad people who invent religion, and there are good people who oppose it. That is the philosophy that lies behind the bright, frankly rather patronizing self-designation for an atheist, unwisely endorsed by Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, which rather unsubtly implied that everyone else was dim. Christopher Hitchens wisely repudiated this piece of arrogant nonsense and lambasted Dawkins and Dennett for their cringe-making proposal that atheists should conceitedly nominate themselves to be called brights. But however unsatisfactory the idea of the bright may have been, it seemed the only way out of this lethal contradiction of the new atheism's own making. So where does this leave us? The philosopher John Gray insists that we need to be critical of human nature and recognize its limitations and aberrations. Yes, he declares religion can go badly wrong. But the fault is not with religion any more than science is to blame for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or medicine and psychology for the refinement of techniques of torture. The fault is in the intractable human animal. Perhaps we should not be surprised that some human animals are now actively seeking to overcome those limitations, not by retreating into an implausible world in which humanity is declared to be good, but by redirecting the evolutionary process. Human beings have always dreamed of creating better worlds and better people. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein has become the archetypal statement of the dream of creating new life through technology and the nightmare of what happens when this new life form turns against its creator. H.G. Wells' novel The Land of Dr. Moreau explored more explicitly Darwinian themes, such as whether evolutionary processes can be short circuited, allowing an intermediate transition from animals to humans. These dreams have now been given new energy by scientific and technological advances. Darwin, many argue, showed us how we evolved. Why can we not now take charge of the process and direct our own future evolution? Why should we not take charge of the gene pool and make sure that defects are excluded, thus ensuring the future of humanity? Since we understand so much about the human body, why should we not enhance its capabilities, going far beyond our present capabilities and significantly extending our life expectancies? Such questions have evoked deep cultural concerns about scientists playing at being God. It is a criticism that is easily dismissed but which cannot be ignored. If human beings were as rational as moral as we would like them to be, there might not be a serious problem. But human beings are very good at getting things wrong, and technology lets them mess things up in a way that might turn out to be irreversible. In this section, we will look at the emergence of the movement now known as transhumanism and ask where this has taken us. So, what is transhumanism? Transhumanism can be described in a number of ways. The movement affirms both the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminate aging and thus to enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. This goal is to be achieved by the use of technology, which means studying the promises and potential dangers of technology that will enable us to overcome our present fundamental human limitations. The transhumanist agenda thus goes beyond using technology for therapeutic purposes alone. Transhumanism argues for the acceleration of human evolution through technological enhancement. So is this Darwinianism? Or not? So is this Darwinian? Not really. Human evolution cannot be described in purely Darwinian terms on account of the role of cultural in enabling humanity to transcend its biological limitations. Darwinism certainly accounts for the biological evolution of humanity. The cultural evolution of humanity is probably better described using a Lamarckian model, in other words, in terms of intentional development. Transhumanism sees no reason to wait for humanity to evolve further. It wants to take charge of the evolutionary process and construct a new humanity, including a new rationality, liberated from its original biological limitations. Some transhumanists are optimistic that the human lifespan can be extended indefinitely through technology, in effect reviving classic ideas about a fountain of youth. Transhumanism is still an emerging movement, showing significant differences in emphasis and outlook within its ranks. It is still too early to evaluate it properly. However, it seems appropriate to note a question, which it being widely discussed within the transhumanist movement itself. This is the question of existential risks, defined as risks that threaten the entire future of humanity. Natural risks such as asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or gamma rays bursts have always been present and will remain so. The new concern is that as humanity's power expands, so will the scale of their potential consequences. An increasingly powerful humanity may make mistakes which threaten its own existence. After all, humanity has always developed the means for destroying itself and can be expected to develop further such tools in the coming century. Yet these anthropogenic existential risks, that is, those caused by human activity, might not necessarily arise from war or terrorism. Some of the biggest existential risks will arise through potential future technological breakthroughs that may radically expand our ability to manipulate the external world or our own biology. The development of advanced forms of biotechnology and machine intelligence may have outcomes that we cannot predict and may not be able to control. So will technological advance lead to wiser and better decisions that humanity has made in the recent past? Let's hope so. But our history is not reassuring at this point. We are not very good at learning from our mistakes. Does the enhancement of human technologies possibilities mean that we need more enhancement to be able to cope with the new challenges we face? Do we need to be rebooted morally? Ingmar Persson, University of Gothenburg, and Julian um, Savluscu, Oxford University, have raised concerns which need to be addressed. Modern technology provides us with the means to cause our downfall, yet our natural moral psychology does not provide us with the means to prevent this. Therefore, they argue, the moral enhancement of humankind is necessary if we are to find a way out of this predicament. This worries many of us. Who will carry out this enhancement? Who will reprogram us? This is a clear and uncomfortable dilemma here, in that these moral enhancements will need to be developed and chosen by morally questionable human beings who could easily adapt them to advance their own vested interests and concerns. People, we do need a new reality. Perhaps we do need a new morality. Then again, maybe we need to revisit older options and adapt them to the new situations we may face. We face difficult questions as human beings, and science is not going to answer them on its own. We will come back to that concern in a later chapter when we reflect on the basis of ethics. All right. Well, there's that chapter. So yeah, this is pretty much getting better and better. Cool thing is, it's got 2 more chapters of this book, and then I will take a break from the reading vlog. We'll still vlog, but like I mentioned in past videos, after this book, I'm going to continue reading, but I will read these on my own. I will probably mention them a little bit in a video as far as a book I'm about to start and when I finished. But as far as reading it, I probably won't do that again for a while. So you can still look for more vlogs just of stuff that are different, which you can let me know in the comment section below what you would like me to maybe talk about or do. Fun, serious in between on here. For the most part, yeah, that's it. 2 more chapters left. The chapter that I will be reading tomorrow, and this may or may not be 2 chapters. I know they're somewhere in the 20 pages, but tomorrow I will read chapter 7, The Quest for the Meaning and the Limits of Science, and if I have time after that, then I may read chapter 8, which is an empirical ethics, science, and morality. So that's going to be an interesting day tomorrow. So yeah, the goal will be to read the 7th chapter, but if I have time, then I may read 7 and 8, and then close the book with chapter 9 when I get home on Friday night after work. And yeah, so that's it. I will end this video here. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching. Ram Ram.